Good evening. I am Bill Dixon, the host of Lessons of Vietnam show. Hope you are doing well tonight, and thank you so much for tuning in. Let's get right into that first slide, Emma, if you don't mind. There you go. We try to tell the story of the Vietnam War and the men and women who served in the United States military during that time and dispel the truths, dispel the myths and the half-truths. Again, I'm your host, Bill Dixon, Vietnam veteran 6768. We're broadcast courtesy of Nissan Communications from their worldwide headquarters in Raleigh, North Carolina. If you have any comments and suggestions, please reach out to me at dixonbill80@yahoo.com and give me any suggestions or any feedback you like. We always invite you to participate in the show while we're live. So you can dial 919-518-9773. That's area code 919-518-9773. Or even better, go on to Skype and put in computers 2K voice. And you can put your comments in and speak on the air or whatever you need to do and keep us going. As we have talked about before, with COVID, lockdowns and so forth, it's been a very hard time for a lot of veterans who, especially Vietnam veterans who, a lot of their friends are passing away. They've been locked up in home and haven't been able to get out. If you are a veteran, you know a veteran who's in crisis, please reach out at 1-800-273-8255. And to speak to a veteran, you need to press 1. There's be somebody answering the phone either way, but if you want to speak to a veteran, you need to press 1. We're coming up on a special holiday, kind of, or anniversary, I guess would be a better word. April 29th is the anniversary of the fall of Saigon in 1975. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight on the show. I've got some other information for you, but I'm going to try to wait to the end of the show. So let's get right on into the show here and kind of get you going. I think it's a pretty good information. At the end of the World War II, the United States was looking at looked at very favorably by Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Cong forces due to the aid and training they received from the American Special Team known as the Deer Team in their fight with the Japanese occupiers during World War II. It was never officially promised, but it was alluded to that the United States would back Vietnam's independence in order to get Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh to help out with downed pilots and also to keep the Japanese busy. On September 2nd, 1945, the day of Japan's official surrender, Ho quoted from the United States Declaration of Independence as part of a speech in which he implored the Allies to recognize Vietnam's independence. He later made multiple additional attempts to get the United States on his side. Through the terms of the 5 U.S. presidents, that relationship deteriorated, and the United States and Vietnam found themselves at war. The French Indochina War, second, I'm going to make an adjustment right here so I can see it better. That would go. All right. The French Indochina War broke out in 1946 as a result of the treaty giving France back the Vietnam after the World War II. 1946, it went on for 8 years, fought between the Vietnam and the French, who got control of their former colony, Vietnam, at the end of World War II. It was a war for France to regain their colony, but also a war against communism, which brought in the Truman Doctrine. President Truman, United States President Truman, feared that Vietnam too become a communist state. President Truman sent over transports, planes, and jeeps, along with 35 military advisors, as part of a multi-million-dollar aid package to France. And that was in 1946 now. U.S. involvement in the conflict would only deepen from there. By the end of Truman's presidency, the United States was funding more than 1/3 of France's war costs, a number that would soon skyrocket to about 80%. So when France lost Dien Bien Phu, we were paying 80% of all the expenses when they were fighting the Viet Minh. After their shattering defeat by the Viet Minh at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in May 1954, the French came to the end of their rule in Indochina. The battle prodded negotiators at the Geneva Conference to come up with the final Geneva Accords of July 1954. The Accords established the 17th parallel, latitude 17 north, as a temporary demarcation line separating the military forces, the French and the Viet Minh. North of the line was the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or North Vietnam as we call it, which had waged a successful 8-year struggle against the French. The North was under the control of the Workers' Party or Vietnamese Communist Party led by Ho Chi Minh. Its capital was Hanoi. And you can see the French there giving up. In the South, the French transferred most of their authority to the state of Vietnam, which had its capital at Saigon and was normally under the authority of the former Vietnamese Emperor Bao Dao, who the Japanese had set up and with the French. Within 300 days of signing the accords, a demilitarized zone, or DMZ, was to be created by mutual withdrawal of forces north and south of the 17th parallel. And you can see there in the picture, just above where it says demilitarized zone there, there's a blue arrow, which is kind of hard to see. Up there you see in red is Hanoi, the communist capital, and down below you can see the yellow arrow going to Saigon. As the French were standing down, leaving Vietnam in 1955, the strongly anti-communist politician Diem pushed Emperor Bao aside to become president of the government Republic of Vietnam. And you see there in 1956 was the last French guys pretty much left. It's in waving. The Accords allowed the Vietnamese people a year to relocate either north or south of the 17th parallel. More than 1 million Vietnamese went to South Vietnam, with some going up to the north. Some of those relocating were former Viet Minh troops. Those former Viet Minh formed the National Liberation Front, NFL, to organize resistance to the government of Diem. In other words, there were people, spies and undercover people going down into South Vietnam from North Vietnam. As the Cold War intensified worldwide, the United States hardened its policy against any allies of the Soviet Union, and by 1955, President Dwight David Eisenhower had pledged his firm support to them and South Vietnam. That began with sending American military advisors, training, and equipment to assist the South Vietnamese military. Diem's security forces cracked down on the Viet Minh sympathizers in the South, whom he derisively called Viet Cong. That's where the name came from. President Diem, you see in the picture with Time magazine. He's the one that came up with that. He arrested 100,000 people. Many were brutally tortured and or executed. As you can see there, the Buddhist monk who burned himself. Diem was a Catholic and did not get along well with the Buddhists, because some of them were backing the communists. By 1957, the Viet Cong and other opponents of Diem's repressive regime began fighting back with attacks on government officials and other targets. And by 1959, they had begun engaging the South Vietnamese army in firefights. That was some of the other people there in South Vietnam also, not necessarily the Viet Cong. They just didn't like what he was doing. A team sent by President John F. Kennedy in 1961 to report on conditions in South Vietnam advised a buildup of American military, economic, and technical aid in order to help them confront the Viet Cong threat. And you can see the domino theory there, which we're getting ready to talk about. Working under the domino theory, which held that if one Southeastern Asian country fell to communism, many other countries would follow. Kennedy increased U.S. aid, though he stopped short of committing to a large-scale military intervention. By 1962, the U.S. military presence in South Vietnam had reached some 9,000 troops, compared with fewer than 800 during the 1950s. In August of 1964, using a non-event, Johnson ordered the retaliatory bombing of military targets in North Vietnam. Congress soon passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave Johnson extremely broad war-making powers. Never declared war, just gave him the powers. From 1964 to 1972, there were at minimum 5 peace proposals presented by the North Vietnam or the United States, as well as numerous by a third party that got no serious considerations. There was one serious problem. The North Vietnamese communists, the United States, South Vietnam government, the Viet Cong, all had different agendas for a peace agreement. Also, there was a group of Vietnamese who were nationalists that wanted all of Vietnam unified, some under communist rule and some under democracy. So you had all those factions going together. You couldn't get anything done. A coup by some of his own generals with loose support from the United States succeeded in toppling and killing Diem and his brother, Nguyen. And you may have heard of Madame Nguyen, who was the pseudo first lady of South Vietnam. In November of 1963, 3 weeks before Kennedy was assassinated, you can see there Diem was killed in the back of a van. The ensured political instability with ever-changing leadership in South Vietnam led Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara to further increase U.S. military and economic support. There was about 5 or 6 different regimes on the next couple of years there. The American ground war started on the 8th of March, 1965, when the 173rd Airborne engaged with the communists in the Battle of the Hump. If you've heard Big and Rich Country Western song, 8th of November, that's what it's about. You want to listen to the song, especially the one that's got Chris Christopherson opening it up. President Johnson soon increased the deployment of 3,500 U.S. to 200, from 3,500 U.S. soldiers to 200,000. The same year, the U.S. General William Westmoreland developed a plan to shift the U.S. from its defensive operations to a fully fledged offensive against the Viet Cong and its North Vietnamese supporters, which was also the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army. As per plan, U.S. Now this is the way the plan was working. As per the plan, the U.S. could achieve its victory by 1967. Well, that's what they told everybody. President Johnson approved the plan. The U.S. received international aid when countries like Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and the Philippines agreed to send their military troops in to help out. Similarly, the Soviet increased its support to North Vietnam, sending it in aircraft, artillery, ammunition, small arms, radar, air defense systems called SAM missiles, food, and medical supplies. China also helped by sending several engineering troops to North Vietnam to assist in building critical defense infrastructure. They also spent 360,000 soldiers when it was all over with. The next big battle, in November of 1965, I believe it was 13th to 14th, the first large-scale battle of the war emerged in Adrang Valley. There were 2 separate engagements at 2 helicopter landing zones. If you saw the movie, it only showed you the first engagement, did not show you the second engagement. LZ X-ray was the one that was in the movie. LZ Albany was not in the movie. It's in the book. While U.S. forces total 1,000, the Vietnamese numbered to close to 2,500. The battle at LZ X-ray saw the U.S. obtaining the victory, even after being outnumbered. The U.S. troops were ambushed on the way to LZ Albany, and fighting got to be hand-to-hand combat, and the U.S. suffered some 50% casualty rate at going to the Albany to be taken out. Since the forces from both sides had 2 different engagements, both claimed to register victories. Everybody wanted to be the victor. Between 1966 and 1967, U.S. troops numbered in Vietnam rose to 40,000 to 50,000. U.S. aircrafts bombed Haiphong Harbor and North Vietnam airfields in November of 67. In the Battle of Doc To, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces resisted an offensive by communist forces in the Central Highlands. The U.S. suffered 1,800 casualties. Some of them were friendly fire casualties. In January 1968, the Tet Offensive began. It was primarily against the South Vietnamese government by the North Vietnamese. There were attacks on over 30 towns and cities by over 80,000 soldiers, including outposts across South Vietnam, including Hue and Saigon. The U.S. Embassy in Saigon was attacked. The show of strength by the North Vietnamese convinced many Americans that the war was unwinnable. And that's when Walter Cronkite decided that the war was unwinnable at that time and started telling everybody. The United States wanted out of the war, but wanted to save face. So the North Vietnamese wanted a communist unified Vietnam. The VC were somewhat split. Some wanted free nationalism and some wanted communist nationalism. South Vietnam would like a reunification of Vietnam under a democracy. For North Vietnam, any talks of peace talks was used as a military tactic. It was a way to stall. Watch the American protest movement. Frustrated the enemy, which was us, prolonged the war, and to the disillusionment of the American people, even though both sides claimed to be receptive to peace talks, they both used in any delay or failure to blame the opposition. In April 1965, North Vietnam Premier Phan Van Dong presented a four-point plan to what it said was return to the 1954 Geneva Accords and for the United States to withdraw all military personnel. The sticking point was the National Liberation Front was to be in charge in South Vietnam, which was the Viet Cong. In 1966 to 67, several other peace deals were proposed, but nothing either side took seriously. But in May of 1968 saw a secret informal meeting between North Vietnam and the United States in Paris. South Vietnam was not even informed there was a meeting. Hanoi wanted to halt the bombing of North Vietnam, and the United States warned all Viet Cong activities to stop in South Vietnam. This is from an article by Ken Hughes, who was the research specialist with the University of Virginia's Miller Center. He was also translator of the infamous Nixon tapes, which we'll get into in a few minutes. In October of 1968, President Johnson suspends all bombing in North Vietnam, hoping to spur further peace talks. With American elections coming up and Johnson not running for president, presidential candidate Richard Nixon sent word to North Vietnam that when he was elected, they would get a better deal. In other words, don't sign any peace until I get there. 5 days after Nixon was sworn in as president, a delegation from the Nixon administration flew to Paris to start peace talks with the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. Though nothing of any substance was accomplished for more than 4 years, the North Vietnamese used the delay tactics. They questioned the legitimacy of South Vietnamese government to negotiate. The South Vietnamese questioned the legitimacy of the Viet Cong and FL to negotiate. They even fought over the shape of the negotiating table. They found everything to argue about. Nixon promised the people of America peace with honor. I want you to remember this, peace with honor, by a strategy of Vietnamization and negotiation. Vietnamization, he said, would equip the South Vietnamese to defend themselves without American troops. He realized it wouldn't. South Vietnam probably can never even survive anyway, the president said on one of his tapes, the secret tapes. This was no mere passing doubt. On his first full day in office, he'd asked military, diplomatic, and intelligence officials how soon the South would be able to handle the communists on its own. The answer was unanimous, never. The Joint Chiefs, the CIA, Pentagon, State Department, and U.S. military commander in Vietnam, General Creighton Abrams, all agreed that Saigon, even with fully modernized, would never survive without U.S. combat support in the form of air, helicopter, artillery, logistics, and major ground forces. Nixon faced a stark choice: continue sending Americans to fight and die in South Vietnam's defense for the foreseeable future, or bring the troops home, knowing that without them, Saigon would ultimately fall. There was no way he could sell either option. Endless war withdrawal followed by defeat. As a peace with honor, he promised. So he lied. The day the South Vietnamese can take over their own defense is in sight, he says. Our goal is a total American withdrawal from Vietnam. We can and we will reach that goal through our program of Vietnamization, he said. Despite his advisors' unanimous consensus, which will remain classified in his own private assessment. To make Vietnamization look successful, he spaced withdrawal out over 4 years, gradually reducing the number of American soldiers in Vietnam from over 500,000 in January 1969 to less than 50,000 by Election Day 1972. Throughout those 4 years, he made many national televised speeches to announce partial troop withdrawals, claiming each one proved Vietnamization was working. Also, he left enough Americans fighting and dying to conceal the fact that Vietnamization never really would work. In this way, the president made slow retreat look like a steady progress. Nixon sounded willing to abandon his political timetable in return for the release of American prisoners of war, who routinely endured torture by their North Vietnamese jailers. If they'll make that kind of a deal, we'll make that anytime they're ready, Nixon said on March 19, 1971, more than a year before the election. But this is what Henry Kissinger had to say. Well, we've got to get enough time to get out, Kissinger said. We can't have it knocked off over brutally, to put it brutally, before the election. Now, we can't have this to happen before the election. That's right, Nixon said. The POWs, like American soldiers in Vietnam, had to wait on Nixon's political timetable before they could come home to their loved ones, the ones who survived long enough to come home. Publicly, Nixon insisted that he needed to keep American troops in Vietnam to pressure Hanoi to free the prisoners. Privately, he acknowledged the opposite was true. The North would only release the POWs when he agreed to withdraw all American ground forces. Prolonging the war meant prolonging the POWs' captivity. A senator once asked how 50,000 soldiers would be enough to persuade Hanoi to free the POWs when 500,000 did not. Of course, I couldn't say to him, look, when we get down to 50,000, then we'll make a straight out trade. 50,000 for the prisoners of war. And they'll do it in a minute because they want to get out of there. Negotiations, like Vietnamization, served Nixon's political ends. All he wanted was a decent interview. Kissinger described in the margin of a briefing booklet on his secret trip to China in July 1971. You have our assurance for decades. Kissinger has denied making a decent deal, one that would merely put a year or two between Nixon's final troop withdrawal and Saigon's final collapse. Kissinger's denials have collapsed under the weight of his own words caught on Nixon's tapes and transcribed in memos by NSC aides to document negotiations with foreign leaders. During this initial encounter with Chinese premiers Mao and Lao, Kissinger outlined Nixon's requirement for a Vietnam settlement. Peace wasn't one of them. Nixon did need the POWs, total American withdrawal, and a ceasefire for, say, 18 months. After that, if the communists overthrew the Vietnamese government, we would not intervene. In other words, Hanoi didn't have to abandon its plans to conquer the South, just hold off for a year or two. The Soviet Union received the same assurance. During a closed-door session with Nixon during the 1972 Moscow summit, Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev said, Dr. Kissinger told me that if there was a peaceful settlement in Vietnam, You would be agreeable to the Vietnamese doing whatever they wanted, having what they want after a period of time, say 18 months. If that is indeed true, and if the Vietnamese knew this and it was true, they would be sympathetic on that basis. In other words, he was talking about the North Vietnam would be sympathetic to the peace. This wasn't just some clever negotiating ploy on Nixon and Kissinger, but part of the trick, the communist part to trick the communists into making a deal. They discussed then strategy in the privacy of the Oval Office. We got to find some formula that holds the thing together for a year or two. Kissinger said on August 3rd, 1972, after a year, Mr. President, Vietnam will be a backwater, and no one will give a damn. The decent interval served an all-important political purpose. If Saigon fell immediately after Nixon withdrew the last American troops, his failure would have been too obvious. Americans would have seen that he'd added 4 years to the war and still managed to lose. Domestically, in the long run, it wouldn't help us all that much because our opponents will say we should have done it in 3 years ago, Kissinger said. He was right about that. Few Americans, liberals or conservatives, Democrats or Republicans, would have been willing to send their children to die for a decent interval. Politics dominated the president's military move. In his first year in office, the Republican National Committee commissioned a secret poll that identified the most popular way to end the war. Pressing on until victory got just 37% support. Agreeing to anything to end the war was even less popular at 30%. But a massive 66% favored bombing and blockading the North to make Hanoi agree to a compromise settlement with free elections for the South. Those polls said they would support the bombing and blockade for 6 months. So on May 8th, 1972, exactly 6 months minus 1 day before the election, President Nixon went on national television and announced that he would bomb the North and mine its harbors. It's all in the timing. Nixon claimed the escalation would cut off supplies for the North to its armies in the South. It didn't. That summer, the CIA estimated that Hanoi would still manage to infiltrate 3,000 tons of war material into South Vietnam every day. 300 tons more than was needed. Although the bombing and mining proved to be strategic failures, they were great political successes. Polls show a large majority approved. No surprise, the strategic failure of the bombing and mining remained classified. When the North accepted Nixon's settlement terms shortly before Election Day, it looked like Nixon's military move had brought the enemy to its feet, but it hadn't. Hanoi took Nixon's deal for the same reason. Saigon refused it. Both sides realized it would lead to a communist takeover of the South, as is Nixon and Kissinger. The president managed to turn losing a war into a winning political issue. In his last campaign speech, nationally broadcast the night before the election, Nixon urged voters to have in mind tomorrow one overriding issue, and that is the issue of peace. Peace in Vietnam and peace in the world at large for generations to come. The president boasted of a negotiating breakthrough, which is one thing to call a deal that is a roadmap to victory for the enemy and a death sentence for an ally. We have agreed that the people of South Vietnam should have the right to determine their own future without having a communist government or a coalition government imposed upon them against their will. He made no mention of the secret assurance that he'd given China and the Soviets that the North could impose a communist government on the South without a fear of U.S. intervention as long as it waited a decent interval of a year or two. There are still some details that I am insisting be worked out and nailed down because I want this not to be a temporary peace. I want, and I know you want it to be a lasting peace. No matter what anyone else wanted, Nixon and Kissinger had been negotiating a temporary peace for more than a year. But this is part of Nixon's statement still. By your votes, you can send a message to those whom we are negotiating and to the leaders of the world that you back the President of the United States in his insistence that we in the United States seek peace with honor and never a peace with surrender. That last phrase, peace with surrender, was meant as a crack at McGovern, who was the Democratic presidential nominee. But it aptly summarizes Nixon's true strategy. What is a decent interval other than slow, secret surrender? But Americans didn't know what their president was really doing on election day. Nixon won 60.7% of the vote, more than any other Republican president in history. The price of political victory included the lives of more than 20,000 American soldiers who died in the 4 years it took Nixon to create the illusion of peace with honor and conceal the reality of defeat with deceit. Afterwards, Nixon blamed the liberals for the consequences of his actions, while the fall of Saigon was built into this decent interval exit strategy. Nixon accused Congress of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. One line of attack was to blast Congress for cutting foreign aid to Saigon. It's true lawmakers gave South Vietnam less than Nixon and later Gerald Ford requested. But lawmakers could have doubled or tripled aid to Saigon. It still would not have collapsed. It still would have collapsed under Nixon's settlement terms. As the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Pentagon, CIA, State Department, and General Abrams had pointed out to Nixon shortly after he took office, the South Vietnamese couldn't handle the communists without the combat support of major U.S. ground forces. Nixon had withdrawn all American troops under the terms of the Paris Accords. That was Hanoi's price for freeing American POWs, and Nixon paid it after he was safely reelected and could afford to let Saigon fall. Without U.S. ground forces, Saigon was doomed, even if by some miracle it received unlimited American aid. Complaining about aid cuts allowed Nixon to evade the truth about his exit strategy. Rather than negotiating safe exits for the South Vietnamese who had fought on the American side of the war, he left them to exit in decent interval combat or live under communist rule. Yes, Congress could have thrown more money at the problem, but Nixon knew that wouldn't solve it. In No More Vietnam, the ex-president in 1985 worked a revisionist personal history. He castigated Congress for voting on June 29, 1973, 3 months after American soldiers and POWs had come home, to ban further combat in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. This defeat stripped me of the authority to enforce the peace agreement in Vietnam and gave Hanoi's leaders a free hand against South Vietnam. Now, let me go right back to this real quick. This is what he says, that with Congress cutting funds, this defeat stripped me of the authority to enforce the peace agreement in Vietnam and gave Hanoi's leaders a free hand against South Vietnam. He already gave all that away. Okay. Let's talk about the Paris Peace Accords. On January 9, 1973, Kissinger and Le Duc Tho, then Ho Chi Minh had passed away, but he had been, Le Duc Tho had been leader of North Vietnam for quite some time before that. They reached agreement on a treaty to end the war in Vietnam. The agreement was signed on January 27th, almost 5 years after the peace negotiations began between the two sides. First opened on May 13, 1968. Under the conditions of the agreement, North Vietnam agreed to drop its demands for a coalition government, one that included communist representation in South Vietnam. In exchange, the United States agreed to allow some North Vietnamese troops to remain in the South, as long as they promised not to resume military aggression. As long as they promised not to resume military aggression. Okay? This section of the treaty left an estimated 160,000 North Vietnamese troops in various regions of South Vietnam. The treaty also provided for an exchange of prisoners of war, POWs, MIAs, between the two sides. All U.S. troops were required to leave South Vietnam 60 days after the return of all American POWs. Finally, the agreement left Thu in charge of the Saigon government, but also created a committee of national reconciliation that included political representatives from the North Vietnam. This organization was charged with supervising elections for a new government in which all parties, including communists, could take part. Historians agree that this part of the treaty left the political future of South Vietnam very much in doubt. Thu forced to go along. President Thu was outraged by the terms of the peace agreement. He told U.S. officials that he would never agree to its condition. The Nixon administration reacted to this threat in two ways. First, they tried to reassure South Vietnam's president that Nixon ordered the immediate delivery of $1 billion in military equipment, a gift that left South Vietnamese with the fourth largest air force in the world. The administration also promised to provide other military and economic aid to the government. In addition, the United States promised South Vietnam that it would take swift and severe retaliatory action if North Vietnam violated the peace agreement. But second, Nixon administration officials warned Thu that America was going to go forward with the agreement whether Thu approved or not. Fearful that the United States would simply abandon him, Thu reluctantly dropped his objection to the treaty. The Paris Peace Accords did not immediately end U.S. involvement in Indochina. American planes continued to bomb targets in Laos until February 21st, when a peace agreement ended that nation's civil war was signed. In Cambodia, meanwhile, the United States continued to bomb communist opponents of Lon Nol's national government. But to most Americans, the January 1973 Paris Accords marked the end of U.S. military involvement in Indochina. On March 29th, the last U.S. troops left Vietnam to return home, except for a few special units. The American public expressed great relief when the 1973 Paris Accords were signed. After all, most people had grown very unhappy with the Vietnam War, which had been taking thousands of American lives and plunged the nation into a period of great turmoil. As the last U.S. soldiers returned home, which was questionable there, whether they will last or not, returned home, many Americans looked back over the previous decade with deep regret. The country has spent an estimated $200 billion on the war from the early 1960s to 1973. Over that period, more than 58,000 Americans were killed in Vietnam, while another 300,000 were wounded. In addition, about 2,000 U.S. servicemen were still listed as mission action when the last POWs returned home. Finally, the war triggered bitter division in American families and communities to remain deep for many years to come. Nixon's Record in Vietnam. When the Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973, many Americans, from political leaders and journalists to common citizens, praised Nixon and his administration for their direction of the war effort. The Denver Post, for example, praised the Paris Treaty as a tribute to the skill and statesmanship of Henry Kissinger and to the determined spirit and persistence of President Nixon. The president's supporters argued that his strong leadership, as shown in defiance of anti-war demonstrators and willingness to use American air power, enabled the United States to negotiate a ceasefire that allowed it to leave South Vietnam with honor. I won't say that again, with honor. Opponents of war, however, were more critical of Nixon's recommendation of leaving Vietnam. They argued that the war became even more devastating during his first term of office than it had been during the Johnson administration. They charged that Nixon's heavy use of bombing resulted in thousands of civilian deaths and injuries, and that United States airstrikes virtually destroyed large sections of the country. The tonnage of bombs dropped on Indochina during the Nixon era exceeded that of the Johnson years, wreaking untold devastation, causing permanent ecological damage to the countryside and leaving millions of civilians homeless. James Herring. While Nixon termed the vote a defeat for him, Congress approved the combat ban only in direct response to a message from from Gerald Ford, then the House Minority Leader. You need to listen to this part real carefully. Then the House Minority Leader, promised that Nixon would sign it into law. Excuse me. All right, let's finish it off. I had a frog in my throat. He didn't have to. Earlier that same week, the House had sustained Nixon's veto of a less sweeping bill that would have prohibited U.S. military action in Laos and Cambodia only. The bill's supporters knew they lacked the votes to overturn a veto. They said so on the House floor. One lawmaker was so incredulous when Ford announced that Nixon's agreement to a combat ban for all of Indochina, including Vietnam, that he would have to leave the House floor and telephone the president to confirm that he got the story straight. So we're saying here that it was not Congress that cut off help to Vietnam as far as soldiers or whatever. It was Mr. Nixon or President Nixon. I just finished talking with the president himself for approximately 10 minutes, Ford told his colleagues. And he assured me personally of everything I said on the floor of the House and the commitment by him. Only then did conservative supporters of Nixon in the war join liberals and moderates in voting to prohibit the use of American military power in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. This wasn't a defeat for Nixon, but a smooth legislative maneuver. As memories faded, Nixon would claim that he coulda, woulda, shoulda intervened with American firepower to save South Vietnam. If only Congress hadn't tied his hands. The secret assurance he gave China and the Soviets that he would not intervene remained classified until long after he was dead. Even today, Nixon's real Vietnam exit strategy remains virtually unknown to the public. Although scholars have been writing about it for years, Jeffrey Kimball has published 2 landmark works on the subject, Nixon's Vietnam War and the Vietnam War Files, showing how Nixon engineered his decent interval. Even Jeremiah Surrey, whose Henry Kissinger and the American centuries garnered praise from Nixon loyalists as well as critics, wrote, by 1971, he and Nixon would accept a decent interval between U.S. disengagement and the North Vietnamese takeover of the South. The facts are out. Yet Nixon's stabbed in the back myth lives on. When politicians and pundits debate how and when to exit Afghanistan, as they earlier did with Iraq, they cited the false history of Nixon's success at training the South Vietnamese to defend their government and at negotiating with warring parties to settle their difference through the free election. 2 things Nixon never really managed to do. If Nixon tapes are, in Bob Woodward's witty phrase, the gift that keeps on giving, his backstabbing myth is the gift that keeps on taking. American lives, American fortunes, and the honor of politicians overseeing wars they can't win and are afraid to end, at least until after they're reelected. It's one more reason Iraq and Afghanistan eclipse Vietnam as America's longest wars. The agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam, signed January 27, 1973, never looked like it would live up to its, 4 decades later, it stands exposed as deliberate fraud. The president of South Vietnam, in whose defense more than 50,000 Americans gave their lives, wept upon hearing President Richard Nixon's proposed settlement terms. Hanoi would release American prisoners of war and agreed that the South could choose its government by free election. But the accords through the voting process to a commission that could only act by unanimity, and all but possible to achieve among communists and anti-communists who spent years shooting out their differences. Worse, Nixon would leave North Vietnamese troops occupying and controlling much of the South, while withdrawing all remaining American ground forces. It's only an agonizing solution, said President Nguyen, and sooner or later the government will crumble. National Security Advisor Henry A. Kissinger reported Thu's response to Nixon on October 6, 1972, adding, I also think that Thu is right, that our terms will eventually destroy him. In Vietnam, the peace deal quickly fell apart. Even before the last American troops departed on March 29th, the communists violated the ceasefire, and by early 1974, full-scale war had resumed. Kissinger's damning admission comes from the single most comprehensive and accurate records of a president that was ever been on, likely will be. Nixon's secret taping system, voice-activated recorders wired to a microphone hidden in the Oval Office and elsewhere, clicked on whenever they detected a sound between February 16, 1971 and July 12, 1973, a time when Nixon not only negotiated the Paris Peace Accords and withdrew from Vietnam, but became the first American president to visit China and Moscow, signed the first nuclear arms limitation treaty with the Soviet Union, and won the biggest Republican presidential landslide ever in an election that realigned American politics for the rest of the Cold War. Since Nixon's secret tapes coincided with his most acclaimed accomplishment, lawyers thought that when finally released, they would reveal a foreign policy genius at work, offsetting the sordid image of the unindicted co-conspirators that emerged from the excerpts played in court as criminal evidence during the Watergate trials of the 1970s. They should have known there was a Nixon reason fault to keep his tapes from the American people and his death in 1994. Since then, the government has declassified 2,636 hours. These tapes expose far worse abuse of power than the special prosecutors ever found. After all, as the saying goes, no one died at Watergate. As commander-in-chief, however, Nixon sacrificed the lives of American soldiers to further his electoral ends. Ceasefire. All GIs out of Vietnam in 60 days. Stars and stripes. You can see the Vietnamese taking pictures of the last soldiers leaving. The Myth that Congress cut off funding for South Vietnam by Ken Hughes. Mr. Hughes is the Nixon tapes editor for the President Recording Program at the University of Virginia's Miller Center. Bill Laird, Richard Nixon's defense secretary, started the modern myth that Congress snatched defeat from the jaws of victory by cutting off funding for our ally in 1975 in a 2005 article in Foreign Affairs, the journal of prestigious Council of Foreign Relations. A quick, easy check of an old newspaper database shows Laird's cutoff claim to be false. In the fiscal year running from July 1st, 1974 to June 30th, 1975, the congressional appropriation for military aid to South Vietnam was $700 million. Nixon requested $1.45 billion. Congress cut his aid request, but never cut off aid. Nixon's successor, President Gerald Ford, requested an additional $300 million for Saigon. Democrats saw it as an exercise in political blame shifting. The administration knows that the $300 million won't really do anything to prevent ultimate collapse in Vietnam, said Senator and future Vice President Walter F. Mondale. And it is just trying to shift responsibility of its policy to Congress and the Democrats. Congress didn't approve the supplemental appropriation. In fact, they got up and walked out on him. The Times reported that with National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger's personal prestige tied to peace in Vietnam, aides have said that he will try to pin the blame for failure on Congress. He tried to do just that in March 26, 1975 news conference, in which he framed the question facing Congress as whether it will deliberately destroy an ally by withholding aid from it in its moments of extremity. 3 years earlier, in October 1972, the month in which Kissinger publicly proclaimed that peace is at hand, just before the election, he privately told the president that their own settlement terms would destroy South Vietnam. That's Mr. Kissinger in the picture. Congressional aid cuts didn't determine the war's outcome. Saigon was sealed long before. when Nixon forced it to accept his settlement terms in January 1973. As for Laird's cutoff of funds for Saigon, it just never happened. Even Nixon acknowledged that the 1975 military appropriations for Saigon of $700 million. Nevertheless, Laird wrote in his Foreign Affairs of the day in 1975 when Congress cut off U.S. funding. If owners and editors had asked him what day that was exactly. On the day. The legend gets printed. The imaginary cutoff has made a real impact. In recent years, the nation has debated withdrawing U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. The cutoff that never happened was treated as fact by political pundits and press alike. Newt Gingrich in 1975 says, in 1975, when there were no Americans left in Vietnam, the left wing of the Democratic Party killed the government of South Vietnam, cut off all of its funding, cut off all of its ammunition, and sent a signal to the world that the United States had abandoned its allies. Communist Robert Novak says, Congress ended the Vietnam War with a communist victory by cutting off funds to South Vietnam. U.S. News and World Report. Historians say that congressional Democrats dug themselves into a deep hole when they forced the United States to withdraw from Vietnam and cut off money to the Saigon government in its struggle against the communists. And the question was, which historians or what historians? Laird's cutoff myth just embellished a bigger, more powerful myth begun by his own boss. Nixon claimed that as the signing of the Paris Accords in January 1973, he had won the Vietnam War. But in the years to come, Nixon continued, Congress snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Political spin, Nixon crafted the secret strategy to foster the illusion that the public strategy of Vietnamization and negotiation worked. Vietnamization was supposed to train the South Vietnamese army to defend itself so the American army could come home. Negotiations were supposed to produce a settlement guaranteed the South's right to choose its own government. Nixon privately realized that Vietnamization and negotiations would not work as he had said they would. Just needed enough time. South Vietnam probably can never even survive anyway, he said in private, but never in public. To conceal Vietnam's Vietnamization failure timed the withdrawal of U.S. forces in the 1972 election. This way, California Governor Ronald Reagan could welcome delegates to the Republican National Convention in 1973 with the perfect words to launch the presidential re-election campaign. The last American combat team is on its way home from Vietnam. We won the war. To get the North Vietnamese to accept a settlement that on paper guaranteed the South's right to free elections, Nixon assured them that the Soviet Union and China, they have waited a decent interval of a year or two before taking over South Vietnam, he would not intervene. The communists accepted Nixon's settlement terms because they knew that they didn't have to abide by them and they would get a clear shot at overthrowing the South Vietnamese government if they waited approximately 18 months after Nixon withdrew the last U.S. ground forces. Nixon wanted this decent interval to make it look like Saigon's fall wasn't his fault. He started the myth that Congress lost the Vietnam War to conceal the fact that he lost it himself. In reality, the agreement was little more than a faith-saving gesture by the U.S. government. Even before the last American troops departed, March 29th, the communists violated the ceasefire, and by the early 1974, full-scale war had resumed. At the end of 1974, South Vietnamese authorities reported that 80,000 of their soldiers and civilians had been killed in fighting during the year, making it the costliest of the Vietnam War. By 1974, several factors had led to the demise of South Vietnam. The Arab-Israeli War of 1973 triggered an economic crisis with rising inflation and soaring petroleum prices, causing problems all over the world and, more significantly, angered American consumers. The gas winner. The political environment in America had changed drastically. President Nixon resigned from office in August of 1974, and the American people were becoming increasingly vocal against continued aid for a war that they felt had ended in 1973. Eventually, Congress bowed to the pressure and significantly cut Vietnam's military and financial aid. Faced with a money shortage and high inflation, South Vietnam was suddenly unable to purchase the weapons necessary to engage the North Vietnamese army, which was also the Russian army and the Chinese army. During this time of crisis, the North Vietnamese secretly planned a major offensive meant to push deeply into South Vietnam territory in early 1975. But they weren't quite certain. They kind of Nixon might have lied too. To make sure that the United States would not re-enter the war, the communists fell out the United States Congress by a series of small attacks in South Vietnam. They attacked this little area, and they attacked this area, and nothing happened. When there was no response from the U.S., they escalated their attacks. A lot of the South Vietnamese officers deserted their posts, causing a lack of leadership for the troops, and resulted in mass hysteria in many of the South Vietnamese military units. As the North Vietnamese were coming down with their 700 and some tanks, and there were small towns and so forth were falling. In January 1975, Phuc Long fell into the communists. That was in South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese government had always believed that if the North Vietnamese violated the terms of the peace accords, the Americans would return with force to help them. After all, Nixon said they would. You can kind of get the idea. Let's see. Phuc Long was down here in the southern part of South Vietnam. Number 2 was the Ban Ma Thuot. Number 3 was the Dar province, which was part of here. And then you had Cam Ranh Bay here, we're going to be talking about. Da Nang is up here where the DMZ is there. And also Pleiku. South Vietnamese, that's good. All right. Next. South Vietnamese President Thieu requested more U.S. aid to help regain the lost territory. Unfortunately for South Vietnam, massive American was not coming. Congress sent a delegation to Vietnam to judge the situation. They did recommend an immediate increase in aid to South Vietnam, but the situation continued to deteriorate. It became apparent that South Vietnam could not survive much longer. The fall of Ban Ma Thuot on March 10th affected the situation in 2 distinct ways. First, Paul Strunk, the U.S. Providence representative for Dar Lac, along with several American missionaries, were captured and in the defeat. Second, several Vietnamese employees of Air America were captured and executed by the North Vietnamese. The captured Americans, combined with the Argonne losses, convinced Congress to deny further aid to South Vietnam and to urge the Americans remaining in country to plan to leave Vietnam. The execution sparked a mass panic across South Vietnam, causing both civilian and military personnel to flee in the face of the Communist army, often before a shot was even fired. As the panic continued, Thieu feared for his own safety, pulled the elite airborne rangers out of I Corps and 2 Corps, which was up by Ban Ma Thuot, and moved them into Saigon to defend the capital. Now the communists had to go through I Corps and 2 Corps to get down to 3 Corps where the capital was. So he pulled all of the best soldiers down there. These actions destabilized the situation in the northern province of South Vietnam and allowed the North Vietnamese to take I Corps and 2 Corps were virtually unopposed. On March 15th, the Pleiku, Kon Tum, and Dar Lac province in the Central Highlands were abandoned by the senior military officials, leaving the civilians and remaining Argonne troops to find their own way to safety. Many of them walked south to Nha Trang, most without any weapon or supplies for the journey, while communist troops continued to harass and fleeing refugees. The remaining Argonne troops defended the convoy to the best of their abilities, but 30,000 to 40,000 people were killed or died of starvation during the 15-day retreat. The press dubbed this event the Convoy of Tears. As the march continued, Da Nang became choked with almost 1 million refugees and leaderless soldiers. Looting and panic rocked the city until the final evacuation on March 26th, 27th, and 28th area. The Americans airlifted their personnel out of Da Nang and tried to evacuate as many of their Vietnamese workers as possible, but many were left behind. Ed Daly of World Airways flew a mission out of Saigon airfield at Da Nang in an effort to save more people. And this is what you saw on TV back that time. The first of his planes to land were mobbed so bad they almost did not take off. The pilot had to tell the others not to land because it was too dangerous. Desperate people began filling boats in the harbor as an effort to escape the city, and many left with nothing but their clothes on their back. By the time the boats arrived in Cam Ranh Bay on April 1st, many refugees had died of thirst. Americans watched their television with horror and anger as cities and towns with names that were familiar to them from their service in Vietnam or previous news were once again featured on the evening news. Now, I'm going to do this part, and then I'm going to end it, and we'll pick it up the next show. One by one, the South Vietnamese cities began falling to the North Vietnamese. Nguyen, Nha Trang on April 1st, Cam Ranh Bay and Pham Rang Bay on April 15th, Pham Viet on April 19th. The political situation in Saigon rapidly deteriorated, and the North Vietnamese government made it clear they would not negotiate with President Thu. On April 21st, Thu resigned the presidency with the hope that his successor would be able to negotiate better surrender terms with Hanoi. Over the next week, the presidency changed hands twice, finally settling on General Nguyen Van Minh, also known as Big Men. On April 29th, the North Vietnamese established positions outside Saigon and began shelling Tan Son Nhut Air Base. 24 hours later, the last of the Americans had left, and the North Vietnamese came streaming into the city. Basically, that was the fall of Saigon, and that's how it got to be, how it started from the beginning. So on April 29th, which is tomorrow, I guess, I think it is, or the day after tomorrow, I don't know what day this is, that was the fall of Saigon. Coming up with things that are going on, I have been thinking and so forth. I'm trying to keep this show relevant. I'm trying to keep it so that it has good information. And over the past, I started this June in 2013, the first show. Bob Matthews and I did, and he moved back up north. But there's been a lot of shows, some good shows, some that were not as good as I wanted. But I am the researcher, I am the putter together, and I am the host. In other words, I do the whole show, except for Amnon controlling the buttons and telling me what to do during the show. So I have decided to cut back. I'm not going to cut out the show. We're just going to try a different format. We're going to be doing the show once a month instead of twice. But you may want to write this down. We're going to change the date and the time. I know that at 8 o'clock, I'm in competition with all the primetime shows and so forth. So as of the next show, which will be May 10th, we're going to switch to the second Monday of the month. And it's the second Monday of the month. May 10th will be the next show. And we're going to come on at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That will give us come on before the prime time and the news and all starts. So looking forward to you coming back on May 10th to see the rest of this part we just did not finish up tonight about the fall of Saigon and afterwards, which will be our next show. So May 10th at 3 o'clock. Hope to see you then. This coming Saturday, if you're in the Word Triangle, the POW MIA ceremony has been going on since about 33, almost 34 years now. I'll be at first Saturday. So come join us down there, and looking forward to seeing you there. And we'll see you on May 10th. Stay safe.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.